On the evening of 31 October 1955, at Clarence House in London, Princess Margaret ended the most scrutinized relationship in Britain with a statement read on BBC Radio shortly after 7 o'clock. Group Captain Peter Townsend wasn't named as a forbidden fantasy or a private disappointment. He was named directly. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend," Margaret said. "I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage." Then came the language that shaped the story for the next 70 years. "Mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." The public heard a sacrifice. A princess had supposedly been forced to surrender the man she loved because the Crown, the government, and the Church had left her no alternative. The surviving documents show something more complicated and more revealing. Margaret had a legal route to marriage after her 25th birthday. The government had prepared a plan allowing her to keep her title and her £6,000 civil list allowance. The Church could block an Anglican ceremony, but not a civil marriage. Her sister's government was willing to let the relationship continue under conditions Margaret had to accept. The decision wasn't simply a story of a woman with no choice. It was a choice between two versions of royal life. Peter Townsend entered the Windsor orbit in February 1944, when he became temporary heir equerry to King George VI. The appointment was made permanent later that year. He was a decorated Royal Air Force officer, a Battle of Britain fighter pilot, and a man the king trusted with the practical business of royal life. Margaret first knew him when she was 13. The relationship became more significant during the royal tour of southern Africa in 1947, when Margaret was 17 and Townsend was 32, married, and the father of two sons. He accompanied the royal party as the king's equerry and helped supervise the princesses during riding activities. Townsend's later memoir placed their first meeting in 1944. Popular retellings often begin the romance in 1947 because the South African tour provides a cleaner romantic origin. The record supports Townsend's presence in 1944 and the tour's importance in their growing closeness. It does not provide a single, uncontested moment when friendship became love. By 1951, their proximity was visible to people around them. Townsend was still married. His marriage to Rosemary Pauley ended in divorce in 1952, the same year Margaret's father died. George VI died on 6 February 1952, aged 56. Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II, and Margaret's relationship with Townsend moved into a more dangerous constitutional setting. Townsend remained connected to the household and became controller of the Queen Mother's household. Margaret, meanwhile, was no longer simply a young princess living under her father's protection. Her sister was now sovereign, head of the Commonwealth, and supreme governor of the Church of England. Townsend later wrote that he and Margaret found solace in one another's company after the king's death. That phrase comes from a retrospective memoir, not a contemporaneous diary. The closeness itself is widely recorded. The precise emotional meaning belongs to Townsend's later account. Several biographies state that Townsend proposed in April 1953 and that Margaret accepted. There was no official engagement announcement. The palace didn't present the relationship as a settled marriage plan, and the press treated it as rumor until a small gesture made the private problem public. On 2nd of June 1953, during Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, Townsend recalled Margaret brushing a bit of fluff from his uniform. He later wrote, "But that little flick of her hand did it all right." After that, the storm broke. The gesture is supported by Townsend's memoir and later accounts. Its precise setting is less secure. Some versions place it outside Westminster Abbey, others in a retiring room or at a gathering after the ceremony. The famous photograph and the later storytelling turned one movement of Margaret's hand into the instant revelation of a great romance. The image survived because it was perfect television. The young princess, the older war hero, the tiny act of intimacy in the middle of a coronation. It also concealed the machinery already gathering around them. Townsend was divorced, and his former wife was still alive. In the Church of England during the 1950s, a divorced person whose former spouse remained living couldn't normally remarry in church. That was a religious and social barrier, not an absolute ban on a civil marriage. The distinction mattered. Margaret's statement referred to the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, who had conducted the 1953 coronation and would conduct Margaret's later wedding, was a major religious authority in the episode. Margaret consulted him before the October announcement, and his 1955 writing restated the Church's opposition to remarriage in church when a former spouse was living. Fisher could advise. He could refuse an Anglican ceremony. He couldn't personally erase Margaret's civil legal capacity to marry. The government acted more directly. In July 1953, Townsend was posted as air attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels. The posting was an established diplomatic appointment, but its timing made it look like exile. Townsend later described the measure as slightly disciplinary. He lived alone in a Brussels hotel, and Margaret continued corresponding with him during the separation. The separation lasted nearly 2 years. Townsend was away, but the relationship didn't disappear. Margaret's August 1955 letter to Prime Minister Anthony Eden stated that she intended to see Townsend in October because only by seeing him in this way that I feel I can properly decide whether I can marry him or not. That sentence is important because it places the decision where the surviving evidence places it. In the autumn of 1955, after Margaret could meet Townsend again, after the constitutional terms had been discussed, and after the consequences of marriage had become more concrete. Margaret turned 25 on 21st of August 1955. Her birthday changed the legal procedure. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 applied to descendants of George II. Before the age of 25, Margaret required the sovereign's consent to marry. After reaching 25, she could begin a statutory process without that consent by giving 12 months' notice to the Privy Council. During that period, Parliament retained the ability to object. That was hardly romantic freedom. It was a legal route surrounded by delay, publicity, parliamentary risk, and political pressure. But it was a route. Margaret wasn't legally trapped inside a simple command from her sister. She could have given notice. She could have accepted a civil ceremony. She could have faced parliamentary opposition and the public consequences of challenging the crown. The law made marriage possible without making it easy. The financial record makes the situation even more precise. The Civil List Act of 1952 provided Princess Margaret with an annual £6,000 allowance. The same act created a £9,000 annual payment for her in the event of marriage. Those figures aren't later estimates. They appear in the statute. That matters because the familiar version of the story often says that marrying Townsend would automatically have stripped Margaret of her income. The surviving government plan does not support that claim. Confidential papers released decades later show that Anthony Eden's government and Queen Elizabeth II considered an arrangement under which Margaret could marry Townsend in a civil ceremony, renounce her succession rights, and still retain her HRH style, her title, and her existing £6,000 civil list allowance. She would also receive the £9,000 marriage payment provided for by the 1952 Act. The proposed arrangement was never implemented. It was a plan, not a new law. But it establishes the central financial fact. Margaret wasn't necessarily choosing between Townsend and total material ruin. The arithmetic wasn't £6,000 or nothing. The proposed arrangement allowed £6,000 to continue and added £9,000 upon marriage. Money still mattered, but the mechanism was different. Margaret had to decide whether the financial package was worth surrendering her place in the succession, accepting a civil ceremony, losing the possibility that her children would enter the succession, and living with a public separation from the institutional center of royal life. Townsend's own later description confirms that the losses were material. Townsend wasn't claiming that he had no value as a person. He was recognizing the scale of the world Margaret would have left. He wasn't destitute. Townsend had served in the RAF since 1933, commanded squadrons during the Second World War, and held the rank of Group Captain. He had a military pension, or expected pension, a diplomatic career, and later earned money as an author and travel writer. He also had social standing. He was a decorated war hero, a former royal equerry, and a man with access to the household because of his own service, not because he was an idle outsider. The contrast wasn't a princess choosing between a palace and a penniless stranger. It was a princess comparing a highly protected royal existence with a respectable but much smaller life alongside a man whose career had already moved outside the household. That distinction makes Margaret's agency clearer. Townsend could offer companionship, history, and a life away from court. The Crown offered official rank, public duties, an income protected by statute, and proposed government arrangement, and the continuation of the identity she had possessed since birth. The legal consequences also need separating. Renouncing succession rights wasn't the same thing as losing the title. The proposed 1955 arrangement contemplated Margaret retaining her HRH style and title while being removed from the line of succession. Her future children would also lose succession rights. The line of succession was therefore not an abstract ornament. Margaret was third in line to the throne in 1955. Her removal would have changed her constitutional position and that of any children she might have had. A residence was a separate issue again. Margaret lived at Clarence House in 1955, not at Kensington Palace. She didn't occupy Kensington Palace Apartment 1A during the Townsend episode. After her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, she and her husband moved into Apartment 10, while Apartment 1A was renovated. They eventually moved into the four-story, approximately 20-room Apartment 1A in 1963. Kensington Palace apartments were generally grace and favor residences allocated at the sovereign's discretion. There is no evidence that marriage to Townsend would automatically have expelled Margaret from a particular Kensington apartment in 1955, because she wasn't living in Apartment 1A at the time. The proposed government arrangement contemplated her remaining in Britain and continuing public duties, subject to public and Commonwealth opinion. That does not make residence irrelevant. It makes the claim more accurate. Margaret's place within the royal household was discretionary and politically dependent. A marriage outside the accepted pattern could have reduced her access to royal homes, staff, engagements, and ceremonial life. But those losses were institutional possibilities, not automatic clauses in the Royal Marriages Act. The same caution applies to state occasions. Margaret's official status, income, residences, and access to royal duties were related, but they weren't one legal bundle that vanished the moment she married. Some consequences were constitutional, some were financial. Others would have depended on decisions by the sovereign, the government, and the household. The choice was costly, because all those systems were connected. By October, Townsend returned to London. He arrived on 12 October 1955 and spent 19 days in a media storm. Contemporary reporting described Margaret seeing him, dining with him, and attending a cocktail party on 19 October. Reporters waited for a decision while the pair moved through a city that already treated their private relationship as national property. On 31 October, Clarence House released Margaret's statement. "I have reached this decision entirely alone," she said, according to the fullest version reproduced in later accounts. She also expressed gratitude for Townsend's unfailing support and devotion, and for the concern of people who had followed the story. The statement presented the decision as personal, religious, and constitutional. It didn't list the £6,000 allowance, the £9,000 marriage payment, the loss of succession rights, or the question of whether Margaret wanted to continue as a fully active member of the royal family. That omission does not prove that money was her primary private motive. Public statements are designed to make a constitutional crisis speakable. Duty to the Commonwealth could describe sincere conviction and still serve as the acceptable language for preserving a royal position. The Queen Mother's role is often presented with more certainty than the record allows. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon controlled the household at Clarence House and was deeply influential in Margaret's life. Later biographies assign her a major role in discouraging the Townsend marriage. But the surviving evidence does not establish a verbatim instruction from the Queen Mother ordering Margaret to end the relationship, nor does it prove that she drafted the final statement line by line. The more secure evidence concerns the wider household and government structure. Sir Alan Lascelles, a senior royal official who had lived through the 1936 abdication crisis, opposed Townsend's position. His experience made the risk of a divorced man entering the immediate royal family impossible for him to treat as a private matter. Elizabeth II's position is also more nuanced than the familiar screen version. National Archives material supports a government-backed plan under which Margaret could marry Townsend while retaining her title and civil list income, provided she renounced succession rights and married civilly. The evidence supports the existence of that plan. It does not provide a complete transcript of a private conversation in which Elizabeth personally offered Margaret a simple permission to marry. The Queen wasn't merely the sister who blocked the wedding. Her government considered a way to permit it. The Church couldn't legally prevent a civil ceremony, but its refusal to accept a church wedding carried enormous weight. Margaret would have been marrying the Queen's former equerry, a divorced man whose first wife was still alive, outside the normal religious form expected of a senior royal. The ceremony itself would have announced the distinction between what the law permitted and what the institution could publicly endorse. Margaret's statement turned that institutional problem into a language of conscience. The private aftermath is much harder to document than the public one. The popular line that Margaret immediately redecorated her rooms after ending the relationship can't be accepted as stated. She was living at Clarence House in 1955, not apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, and the research record does not establish an immediate post-statement redecoration scene. The household evidence does reveal something less theatrical and more useful. Margaret's life continued inside the structure she had chosen to preserve. She remained a working member of the royal family, with official engagements, royal access, and the social privileges attached to her position. The record does not justify saying that she felt no grief. It does show that the decision didn't remove her from royal life. That distinction matters because behavior can't provide a transcript of private emotion. A full social calendar does not prove indifference. A redecorated room does not prove that love was invented. Neither does the public statement prove that duty was the only consideration. The strongest case comes from the convergence of legal and financial facts. Margaret was over 25. The statute gave her a route to marriage. The proposed arrangement protected her title and income. Succession rights and institutional position were placed directly on the table, and Margaret rejected the arrangement. Her choice wasn't between love and absolute poverty. It was between Townsend and a reduced constitutional role that she may have considered unacceptable. Townsend left Britain after the decision. He returned to Belgium and continued building a life that no longer depended on the royal household. In 1959, he married Marie-Luce Germania, a 20-year-old Belgian woman he had met the previous year. Sources differ over the exact age difference, but the marriage itself is well established. They had 3 children and later divorced in 1978. Townsend became a writer of books about the Battle of Britain, travel, George VI, and his own life. His later career gave him an identity beyond the palace romance. He died of stomach cancer in Saint-Léger-en-Yvelines, France, on 19 June 1995, aged 80. Margaret and Townsend didn't vanish from each other's lives immediately. A New York Times report stated that Townsend visited Margaret at her home in March 1958, spending roughly 3 hours there over tea. The relationship ended as a marriage proposal, but it didn't end as a memory. 5 years after the October statement, Margaret married someone else. On 6 May 1960, she married photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones at Westminster Abbey. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher conducted the Anglican ceremony. Armstrong Jones was an unmarried commoner, not a titled aristocrat and not the heir to a great fortune. The marriage was accepted because he didn't bring Townsend's specific religious obstacle, a living former spouse. The difference between the two men wasn't simply rank. Townsend was divorced. Armstrong Jones wasn't. Townsend's proposed marriage required Margaret to renounce succession rights under a special political arrangement. Armstrong Jones's marriage took place within the accepted constitutional structure. After the wedding, Margaret moved into apartment 10 at Kensington Palace with Armstrong Jones, while the much larger apartment 1A was redesigned. The apartment wasn't part of the 1955 decision, but it demonstrates the royal household she remained inside after declining Townsend. The later marriage also prevents an easy moral conclusion. Margaret didn't reject marriage itself. She rejected one particular marriage under one particular set of conditions, then accepted another when the church, the crown, and the succession could accommodate it. That is why the Townsend episode continues to produce disagreement. 2 audience comments attached to later Princess Margaret videos express the corrective view directly. One says, "It was a choice, not a thwarted love story." Another says, "She wanted it all. None of us can have it all." Those comments aren't historical evidence. They can't prove Margaret's motives, and their like counts can change. They do show why the familiar version feels incomplete to modern viewers. The language of helpless tragedy removes Margaret's agency. The archival record puts agency back into the story without requiring the conclusion that she felt nothing for Townsend. A woman can love someone and still refuse the life that relationship requires. She can believe the church's teaching and still understand what the church's position protects. She can feel sorrow and still choose income, title, succession, residence, staff, official duties, and access to the royal world. The evidence does not establish that Margaret rejected Townsend solely for money. It establishes something more precise. She knew marriage could be arranged without total financial ruin, but it would require surrendering her succession rights and accepting a different relationship to the monarchy. The proposed £6,000 allowance and £9,000 marriage payment could preserve income. They couldn't preserve everything. The public statement said Margaret had put duty before personal desire. The government papers show that duty had a price, but also that the price was negotiable. The church shaped the form of marriage. The law supplied a route. The crown offered a compromise. Margaret chose not to take it. By remaining unmarried in 1955, she kept the position she had been born into. She remained Princess Margaret, third in line to the throne, a member of the royal family, a recipient of public income, and a participant in the official life of the monarchy. Townsend left for Belgium, built a separate career, married Marie-Luce Jaman, and spent the rest of his life outside the household that had once placed him beside the king. The love may have been real. The sacrifice wasn't the whole story. Margaret's statement spoke of the church and the Commonwealth. The documents revealed the succession, the civil list, the title, and the constitutional life behind those words. The tragedy narrative gives Margaret no choice. The record does. She chose the royal future she could keep.